We will begin this lecture
on visualization methods of different kernels or filters in a CNN, or perhaps even activations in a particular layer of a CNN, or even other methods that we will see later in this lecture. Most of this lecture slides are based on lecture 13 of CS 231N at Stanford, and some of the content is borrowed from the excellent lectures of Mitesh Kapra at IIT Madras. Let's start by the simplest form of visualization, which is visualizing the filters or kernels themselves. Remember that when you have a CNN, in every convolutional layer, you have a certain number of filters. For example, if you recall, in the AlexNet, the first convolutional layer had 11 cross 11 filters. It actually had 96 of them, 48 going to one GPU and 48 going through the other GPU, if you recall AlexNet architecture. In this particular slide that you see here, we are looking at a variant of AlexNet which was developed by Alex Krzyzewski a little later in 2014, when he came up with a method to parallelize CNNs. This is just an example to be able to visualize this more easily. So in this variant of AlexNet, the architecture had 64 filters in the first convolutional layer. So what you see on the left top here is 64 filters, there are each 11 cross 11 in size, and each of them have three channels, the R channel, G channel and B channel, the three colors. So that's what we have as the total number of filters. So if we visualized each of them on a grid such as this, remember that a filter is an image in its own right. Just like how convolution is commutative, you can always choose to look at an image as a filter or a filter as an image. It does not matter. Any matrix of the size of the filter can also be plotted as an image. So when you do it that way, you get something like what you see on the top right here. So let's try to look at some of them more carefully. So if you visualized some of these filters more carefully, you see that there are filters that try to capture oriented edges. So you can see this one here on the bottom row, the fourth from left, which captures, it looks like a Gaussian edge detector which is smoothened out along a certain orientation. Similarly, you have another edge detector here, another edge detector here on top. You also have some which capture slightly higher order variations, such as a checkerboard kind of a pattern or a series of striations, so on and so forth. You also have color based edge detectors. So in the last filter here on the bottom right, you see an edge detector that goes from green to pinkish or red color. So you see a similar color based filters even on the top left here. So is this a characteristic of AlexNet alone? Not really. If you took even the filters of ResNet 18, ResNet 101 or DenseNet 121, in each of these, the filters in the first convolutional layer have a very similar structure. All of them detect edges of different orientations, certain higher order interactions such as checkerboard patterns, striations and different orientations, color blobs, certain color gradations as in edges in different colors, so on and so forth. You will see this as part of the assignment in this week where you try out some of these experiments. So this tells us that the first layer seems to be acting like low-level image processing, edge detection, blob detection, maybe a checkerboard detection, so on and so forth. Remember here that these are filters that are completely learned by a neural network, which we did not prime in any way. You can also visualize the kernels of higher layers, just like how we did it for the first convolutional layer. You could also take all the filters of the second convolutional layer, the third convolutional layer, so on and so forth. But it happens that if you had to generalize them across applications, they are not that interesting. We did see an earlier example last week where we took face images and showed that filters in the first layer correspond to low-level image features. Then we talked about middle layers extracting noses and eyes and so on. And then we talked about the later layers extracting face level information. It does happen in certain applications, but in general, if you had a wider range of objects, if you only focused on faces or a smaller group of objects, maybe you could make sense of the higher layers filters. But in a more general context, such as ImageNet, which has 1000 classes in the dataset, these kinds of visualizations of filters of higher layers are not that interesting. So here are some examples here. So you can see that the weights, remember in a CNN, the weights are the filters themselves. So if you look at weights in a later layer, you see that it may not be that interesting for understanding what a CNN is actually learning. That's because of the variety of classes that may result in various abstractions across the dataset. So the input to the higher layers is no more the images that we understand. At the input layer, we know what we are providing as input, but when you go to higher layers, you really don't know what you're providing as input, so it becomes a little bit more difficult to understand what's happening. However, if you take the filters of the first layer alone across various models and datasets, hope by now you're familiar with the various CNN models such as AlexNet, ResNet, DenseNet, VGG, so on and so forth. So if you had to look at the filters of the first layer, first convolutional layer, across all of these models, you get very similar kinds of filters, and it's generally called the Gabor-like filters fatigue. Why is that so? Recall the Gabor filters discussion that we had earlier in the course, where we said a Gabor filter is like a combination of a Gaussian and a sinusoid. So, and you can change the scale and you can change the orientation of the Gabor filter, and you end up detecting edges in different orientations. You perhaps end up detecting different striations, checkerboard patterns, so on and so forth, which is exactly what we see as the CNN learning on its own too. So that's the reason why we call this entire visualization of the filters of the first convolutional layer a Gabor-like filter fatigue. By fatigue here, we just mean it's exactly the same across all of these models and datasets. Another option, other than visualizing the filters in different layers, when we talk about visualizing the filters, remember it's 11 cross 11 or a 7 cross 7 or whatever be the size of the filter, you simply have to plot it as an image. Another thing that you can do is to visualize the representation space learnt by the CNN. What do we mean? If you took the AlexNet, remember that the output of FC7 or the fully connected layer after the in the seventh position of the depth of the network, which we denote as FC7, is a 4096 dimensional vector. Right? That's the layer immediately before the classifier. So what we can do is take all the images in your test set or validation set for that matter, and you forward propagate those images until this particular layer and collect all these 4096 dimensional vectors. What do we do with them? You can now visualize the space of these FC7 feature vectors by reducing the dimensionality from 4096 to any dimension of your choice, but for simplicity, let's say 2 dimensions. How do we do this? Once again, hopefully you have done a basic machine learning course and you know that you can use any dimensionality reduction method to be able to do this. A simple example could be principal component analysis. So you take all of those 4096 dimensional vectors of several input images and you do a PCA on top of them to bring all of them into a 2-dimensional space. A more popular approach, which is considered to be a very strong dimensionality reduction method, is also t-SNE, which stands for T-Stochastic Neighborhood Embedding. This was a method once again developed by Hinton along with van der Martin in 2008. We also have a link for this towards the end of this lecture, so you can play around with t-SNE if you like to understand it more. So when you apply t-SNE on the representations that you get as output of the CNN in the penultimate layer, you end up getting a result such as this. This is in specific for the MNIST dataset, where you have 10 classes. This is the handwritten digit dataset. So you see here that each class invariably goes to its own cluster. This seems to tell us, while we cannot in reality visualize a 4096 dimensional space, by bringing it down to 2 dimensions, we understand that the classes, the representations belonging to different classes are fairly well separated into different clusters. And why is that important? Now, developing a classification algorithm on these representations becomes an easy task. And that's why having a classification layer right after that penultimate layer of representations makes the entire CNN work well to classify. So here is an example of the same for ImageNet. So where this is a plot, a 2-dimensional plot of various images in the ImageNet dataset taken to 4096 dimensional space by AlexNet and then brought down to 2-dimensional space and plotted on a 2-dimensional map. The only thing we are doing here is we are putting the respective image on each location just for understanding what's really happening. So this is just a huge map, and if you had to look at one particular part of it, let's try to zoom in into one particular part of it, you see that all the images corresponding to, say, a field seem to be coming together in this space of representations. For this matter, if you scroll around and see other parts of it, you will see that similar objects, you can see at many points of these embeddings here, that at many points you see very similar objects being grouped together. You see all cars somewhere here, so on and so forth. This tells us that these embeddings or representations that you get out of the penultimate layer actually capture semantic nature of these images, and similar objects of similar semantics are grouped together, while objects of different semantics are far apart from each other. So this gives us an understanding that the CNN's representations seem to be capturing the semantics. Keep this in mind when we talked about handcrafted features and learned representations. This is what we were talking about. In handcrafted features such as SIFT or HOG or LBP, you have to decide what may be useful for a given application and then hand design that filter that you want to use as a representation of the image, after which you may apply a machine learning algorithm. But now we are letting the neural network, the CNN in particular, automatically learn these representations that it needs to solve a particular task. Here is a visualization of the Conv5 feature maps. In AlexNet, the Conv5 feature map is 128 cross 13 cross 13. So there are 128 feature maps, each 13 by 13. If you now visualize them as grayscale images, you can see something interesting here. So when this specific image with 2 people is given as input, you see that one of the filters, or actually there are quite a few of them in fact, seem to be capturing the fact that there are 2 entities in the image. So this could give you a hint that the later layers in the CNN are able to capture these higher level semantics of the objects in the images. Another way of visualizing and understanding CNNs is you could extend the same thought and consider a trained CNN. Remember that all of this analysis is for a trained CNN. After training the CNN, you want to understand what it has learnt. Okay, remember that's the context in which we are talking about this. So you can consider a CNN and consider any single neuron in its intermediate layers. So let's consider that particular one in green. Now you can try to visualize which images cause that particular neuron to fire the most. So you can give different images as input to the CNN and keep monitoring that particular neuron and see which image is making it fire the most. What can we do with that? Now we can work backwards and understand that this particular pixel here will have a certain receptive field in the previous convolutional layer, right? Which means that's the region that led to this pixel being formed in this particular convolutional layer. Similarly, you can take the pixels in the previous layer and look at the receptive field of each of them and find the receptive field in the earlier layer, in this case the first convolutional layer. You can go further again and find out the receptive field in the original image which was responsible for this pixel in the third convolutional layer. Remember, we were also discussing this when we talked about backpropagation through CNNs, where we try to understand the receptive field that leads to a particular pixel getting affected in a particular layer. It's the same principle here. Now, if we took images and try to understand which of them caused a particular neuron to fire, you end up seeing several patterns. So in this set of images, each row corresponds to one particular neuron that was fired, and the set of images and the region inside that set of images, which is shown as a white bounding box, which caused that neuron to fire. So here is the first row. Interestingly, all of those images correspond to people, especially busts of people. It looks like that particular neuron was capturing people until their bust, until their chest. The second neuron here seems to be capturing different dogs, maybe some honeycomb kind of a pattern, maybe even a US flag where it thought that honeycomb kind of a pattern is present. A third neuron captures a certain red blob across all of the images. A fourth neuron captures digits in images. And if you look at the last neuron here, the sixth row, you see that it seems to be capturing specular reflection in all of the images. So over time, as you train these CNNs, each neuron is getting fired for certain artifacts in the images, and this should probably go back and help you connect to dropout, where we try to ensure that no particular neuron or weight overfits to a training data, and we allow all neurons to learn a diverse set of artifacts in images. So this should help you connect to dropout in that sense. Here are further examples of the same idea, where you take different neurons in a CNN and try to see which images or patches of images fired that neuron the most. Once again, you see a fairly consistent trend here, that there are some of them that seem to fire for, I think this is an eye of an animal. There is again some text in images. There is vertical text in images. There is faces. There is dog faces again, and so on and so forth. And the last method that we will talk about in this lecture are what are known as occlusion experiments, which attempt to leverage our objective that we finally want to understand which pixels in an image corresponded to the object recognized by the CNN. Why does this matter? We'd like to know if the CNN looked at the cat in the image while giving the label as cat for the image, or did it look at a building in the background or a grass on the ground. Remember, a neural network learns correlations between various pixels that are present in your dataset to be able to give good classification performance. So if all of your cats in your dataset were found only on grass, a neural network could assume that the presence of grass means a presence of a cat. Obviously, if you have a test set where a cat is found in a different background, the neural network may now not be able to predict that as a cat. So to be able to get that kind of a trust in the model, that the model was indeed looking at the cat while calling it a cat, the occlusion experiments do this using a specific methodology. So given these images that you see here, we occlude out different patches in the image centered on each pixel, and you see the effect on the predicted probability of the correct class. Let's take an example. So you can see a gray patch here on the image. So you occlude that part of the image, fill it with gray, and send the whole image as input to the CNN, and you would get a particular probability for the correct label in this case, which is Pomeranian. So that is plotted as a probability in that particular location. Similarly, you would gray out a patch here, send the full image as input to a CNN, get a probability for a Pomeranian. How do you get the probability? As the output of the softmax activation function, and that probability value is plotted here in this image. So by doing this, by moving your gray patch across the image, you will have an entire heat map of probabilities of whether a pixel or a patch around a pixel reduces the probability of a Pomeranian, or does it keep it the same way. So in this particular heat map, red is the highest value and blue is a lower value. So you notice here that when the patch is actually placed on the dog's face, the probability of the image being a Pomeranian drops to a low value. So this tells us that the image or the CNN model was in fact looking at the dog's face to call this a Pomeranian. So in fact, this entire discussion came out of Zeiler and Fergus's work on visualizing and understanding convolutional neural networks. It's a good read for you to look at the end of this lecture. They in fact observe that when you place a gray patch on the dog's face, the class label predicted by the CNN is a tennis ball, which is perhaps the object that takes precedence when you cover the dog's face. Similarly, in the second image, you see that the true label is car wheel, and as you keep using this gray patch all over the image, you see that the probability drops the lowest to the lowest when the wheel is actually covered. And the third image, more challenging, is where you have two humans and a dog in between them, which is an Afghan hound, which is the true label. You once again see that when the pixels corresponding to the dog are occluded by the gray patch, the probability drops for the Afghan hound drops low. This is even trickier because there are humans and the model could have been biased or affected by the presence of those humans, but the model does well in this particular case. So occluding the face of the dog causes a maximum drop in the prediction probability. To summarize the methods that we covered in this lecture, given a CNN, we're going to call all of these methods as don't disturb the model methods, which means we are not going to touch anything in the model. We are only going to use the model as it is and be able to leverage various kinds of understanding from the model. So you can take the convolutional layer and then visualize your filters and kernels. That's one of the first methods that we spoke about. Unfortunately, this is only interpretable at the first layer and may not be interesting enough at higher layers. And we also talked about the Gabor-like filter fatigue here. You could also take any other neuron, for example in a pool layer, and visualize the patches that maximally activate that neuron. You can get some understanding of what the CNN is learning using this kind of an approach. The third thing that we talked about is you can take the fully connected layer, the representations that you get at the fully connected layer, and visualize the representation and then do a dimensionality reduction method such as t-SNE on these representations, and you get an entire set of embeddings for ImageNet. And lastly, we spoke about occlusion experiment, where you take an input and perturb the input and then see what happens at the final classification layer, and that gives you a set of a heat map that tells you which part of the image the model was looking at while making a prediction. Recommended readings: lecture notes of CS231N, as well as a nice deep visualization toolkit demo video on webpage by Jason Yusinski. I would advise you to look at that. You can also get to know more about t-SNE and t-SNE visualizations as a dimensionality reduction technique on these links provided here. Here are some references.